and I am an assistant professor here at the Daniels faculty, as well as the chair of the faculty's public program. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity as well as the chair of our Daniels. This afternoon's lecture by Jeffrey Howell, I would like to acknowledge of the built environment at the University of Washington, heavily references urban design initiatives, which has been the traditional capital of Taiwan for thousands, and is being held in collaboration with the Global Taiwan Center. Today, this meeting place is still home to which is at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at the University of Toronto. To introduce Jeffrey, I would like to welcome Tom Lecture by Jeffrey Howell. Tom is the director of the Global Taiwan Built Environment at the University of Associate Professor, heavily references urban design initiatives in the traditional capital of Taiwan for thousands, and is being held in collaboration with the Global Taiwan Center. Today, this meeting is still home to which is at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at the University of Toronto. To introduce Jeffrey, I would like to welcome Tom Lecture.
Thank you, Professor Nguyen. And on behalf of the Global Taiwan Studies Programs, I would like to welcome Professor Jeffrey Hall as our distinguished visitor for this term. And Professor Jeffrey Hall teach at the Department of Landscapes Architecture at the University of Washington, and he is the director of the Urban Commons Lab, which focuses on research and public service that contributes to civic engagement, democratization of contemporary city making, and Professor Hall's research, teaching, and practice focus on community design, design activism, Department of Landscapes, Architecture, and Social and Environmental Justice. And he is the director in a career that spans across the Pacific. Professor Howell has worked with indigenous tribes, farmers, and fishers in Taiwan, neighborhood residents in Japan, villages in China, and inner city migrant youth and elders in North America. In projects ranging from conservation, wildlife habitats to design of in a career that spans across, and he has written very extensively on the agency of citizens and communities in shaping neighborhood residents in Japan, with villages, edited and inner city migrants, co-edited books that are over close to dozens of them, that including the insurgent public space, area, urbanism, and the remaking of contemporary city design and transcultural cities, border very extensively on the agency of citizens, green cities, going communities, in shaping learning from urban communities, with others in Seattle, and massive urbanism, understanding the other cities of Asia, including 2016. Public space area. For some decades now, we all, for people who are studying Asia, but also increasingly for working on urban issues, that we know that Asian city has been increasingly become one of the most important sites for thinking about urban futures, for thinking about massive urbanism. And of course, the decade in the past decade with the rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. For some decades now, some of the issues become more than urgent. And some of the most recent publications by Professor Hall kind of highlight those issues, and these, including his 2017 book, Urban and Silent, Urban Resistant Public Space in the Age of Changing Democracy, examine the role of public space in the era of some decades mentioned in the neoliberal, some of the issues become another more dedication, and some of the most recent citations as democracy. Take this for collective creativities, published in 2017, is a compendium of 2017 community engagement techniques that can be applied in silent, urban resistant public space. The most recent examining the role of civic space in urbanism in Singapore and Taipei beyond developmental urbanization, published last year, continue to focus on the civic engagement of transforming urban environments. And of course, he has also been recipient of many 2017 awards. And it's really a great pleasure for me on behalf of the Asian Institute, but also thank you for the Daniel faculty to be the co-host of this event. So So please join me to welcome Professor Hao. And some of the most recent citation estimates Hao's list of collected creativities published in 2017 is a compendium of 2017 community engagement techniques that can be applied inside the urban space.
Thank you, Professor Lan, for the introduction. It's great to be here in Toronto and also in this wonderful building. My talk today, as mentioned before, is sponsored by the Global Taiwan Studies Initiative and Asian Institute. So I will focus on Taiwan.
So it's really a great pleasure for me on behalf of the Asian Institute, but also thank you.
I'm also interested in
Daniel faculty to be
a way to make this more kind of relevant to
please
a broader
audience,
including professional design and planning people in the field. And therefore, the qualifier without border being part of the title. Civic urbanism is actually in the title of the book that we have just published last year. And this was a collaborative project between three co-editors. Today, Cho from National University of Singapore, Blush Kusnik from Hanyang University in Seoul, and myself. In this book, we use the term emerging civic urbanism, or urbanism by the people, and urbanism driven by citizens and communities, as a lens to examine the changing relationship between the state and civil society in the four former Asian tigers, so Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. Therefore, that once represented a model of state-led economic development. Specifically, and just going through this very quickly, we're interested in exploring these five questions. So how do the changing state-civil society relation affect civic urbanism? Who are the actors? What form do they take? What are the different impacts and consequences? And what are the importance and implications in and beyond Asia? Among the cases featured in the book, we identify these four themes that we think highlight specific processes through which civic urbanism has unfolded in these four cities. So activism and resistance do they take? With cases from Hong Kong, Taipei, and Singapore, in consequences, both organized and everyday resistance implications in and collaboration in placemaking, including my own case. Among the cases featured in the book, we identify these four themes in other cases and highlight specific processes through which civic urbanism has unfolded in organization these four cities. So activism and resistance. So for my talk today, I'd like to focus on the case of Open Green as a starting point, on their collaboration in placemaking, and a case which first inspired this notion of civic urbanism without borders. I'll tell you why. The Open Green program is basically a funding program in Taipei that supports community placemaking as a mechanism for bottom-up, community-driven neighborhood regeneration in Taipei. The program offers different levels of funding for different projects. The scales of projects it supports improvements of both public and private properties with basically conditions that they are community and public benefits, including open hours. A mechanism for what made this project interesting is that unlike past community funding schemes that only support community members, so you have to be part of the community to apply for a grant. Under the Open Green program, anyone, so non-profit professionals, artists, anyone can propose project that demonstrates community benefits under this program. What this does is that it started to break down some of the barriers between local communities and outside actors and resources. A cityscape that was traditionally compartmentalized, like the diagram on the left, was now open to a greater range of actors who bring with them additional knowledge, resources, and networks, as represented by the diagram on the right. And so in a way, this can also be called open source urbanism. This approach of placemaking is very different from the typical community-based design process what we are used to here in North America, including my own work in Seattle Chinatown International District. In Seattle, we're fortunate to have a very long list of local organizations within the community that we could work with. And as you can, the list on the right, but not every community has that sort of access to resource, including many in Taipei. So the Open Green program, but the Open Green program did not just come out of the blue. Like many initiatives in Taiwan, it was actually an outcome of protests by citizens. In Seattle, we're fortunate to have 2009 of local Taipei city government within the community that preparation for the 2010 International Floral Expo. On the right, came up with a program. Not every community has that sort of after access to resource, including to encourage private developers to convert. So the Open Green program, but the Open Green program did not just come out of exchange for a development bonus. Like many initiatives in Taiwan, it was actually an four-area ratio, which is very generous. Seattle, we're fortunate to have 2009 of local Taipei city government within the community. This program was met with strong criticism by many civil society groups. Came up with a program. Not every community has a university who staged this flash mob protest to encourage private developers fake parks. So the Open Green program exists, but the Open Green program for 18 months and exchange rule a development bonus. So in the face of the criticism, the staff at the urban regeneration office in Taipei realized that perhaps this would be an opportunity to try something. The program was met with strong criticism, and so they hired a team of experienced community designers from World University to stage this flash mob protest. The area around these sites walkers, so the Open Green program exists, but the Open Green to turn these temporary sites into a series of placemaking experiments. So in the face of the criticism, the staff at the urban regeneration office, one of the first projects was the park that featured a program was met with strong criticism, and so they hired a team of experienced community designers that was developed in collaboration with from the area around these sites, bringing new actors. Traditionally, turn these temporary sites into a series. This park is still around today. In the face of the criticism, more than 10 years later, at the the community, I think partly because that sort of sense of ownership that was built so they another project became one of the first urban collaborations in Taipei. Even though this project no longer exists today, the experiment has spurred a movement that led to a city initiative. Park is still around today. In the face of the criticism, today there are more than 700 urban gardens in Taipei. Credit to one of the most successful municipal urban gardening programs. So another project is NGOs, first urban community stakeholders, even though this project so building on this mechanism of collaboration led to the city park experiment. The Open Green program formally launched with 10 sites in 2014. Today there are about 80 sites throughout the city, both highly urban and another project is initiatives first urban community included even though this nature trail built by residents. So building on this activation of vacant neighborhood sites, so turn them into community gathering space in the neighborhood for events and activities like this. Habitats and pollinator pathways under a freeway ramp, a community garden at a mental health facility that brings together patients, staff, neighbors, and volunteers, a nature school at the city. Activation of vacant bring together school children, turn them into neighbors, volunteers, gathering space, and people who are interested in nature. For events. A school ground in one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city transformed into a freeway urban forest with help a community garden from parents, teachers, volunteers that brings together patients, staff, neighbors. Some of them are actually expert. A nature school at Gufeng White Hut is Gufeng Xiaobaiwu is one of the most successful projects today. In 2014, the Open Green Fund supported the conversion of this vacant two-story building into first a community tour library and then a repair clinic. So this is what the library looked like today. It started with just a few boxes of tour and then became the whole wall of what you see here. And to transform the space into a repair clinic, the White Hat organizers recruited a retired city engineer, Mr. Wen, who's the older gentleman in the middle, and who actually lives far away from the community, and nevertheless was happy to come to lead the initiative. Mr. Wen is an extraordinary engineer. He not only teaches people how to repair, but also created this amazing repair manual so that people could learn how to perform the repair on their own. And so you're looking at a page about blenders. And there are also pages for like electrical fans, rice cookers, you name it. And the diagrams are all hand-drawn. And it's just like one of the most amazing documents I have ever seen. He was also very charismatic and started to attract many volunteers to join him. So volunteers from both inside and outside the neighborhood, as well as people from other corners in the city seeking help with repairing their home appliances. And so even though this is a neighborhood initiated project, the facility is open to everybody, neighbors and non-neighbors. The same place is also used for a variety of events such as this training workshop for community designers. And then through these activities, the project turned a vacant space into a vibrant community hub. One important ingredient of success was that the fact that it is open to both neighbors and non-neighbors. So bring together people who otherwise would not be able to connect with one another, to engage in acts of sharing and mutual aid. It builds and expands networks of reciprocity, so urban regeneration from a relational perspective. And as more and more users and volunteers came to join, additional programs have been added. So on the left, you're looking at the schedule from 2015. This is when I started this work. And on the right, so it's kind of midway through this period, so expanded schedule from 2018. And then additional sites and spaces were added as well, so including the activation of another vacant space in the neighborhood, a ground floor apartment unit in a government-owned dormitory. The interior space has been converted into a community kitchen that served meals and provided a social space for older adults in the neighborhood with help from volunteers, including an in-house volunteer chef. And the folks include those who have, who come and join include those who have moved away but continue to have strong ties with the community. Those space really kind of serve as a vehicle that allow people to return and visit their friends and maintain their social ties. The same space is also used for a variety of activities such as this weaving workshop, also led by a volunteer instructor. So again, people who otherwise would not have the opportunity to connect with one another are now able to because of the effort by the volunteers and organizers. So with more activities added to this space, they also realized that they needed additional entrances, including access to the alleyway, which led to this alleyway activation project with shade-tolerant plants and remote control automatic irrigation system. So urbanism without border in the sense that things that just keep getting added. The latest addition was this additional courtyard space just behind the vacant building, the initially kind of vacant building, that which is now being used as a composting area, a outdoor workspace for people who come to the White Hut. And the activities at the White Hut have since spilled over into other neighborhoods in the city, including the what they call the Timber Hut. So like a sister space located in the historical neighborhood known for its timber trade. The space was set up with help from volunteers at the White Hut. So again, another example of civic urbanism, truly without borders. Even though the Open Green program had its beginning with civic activism, it is still a government program after all. So how does it reflect or align with broader societal changes in Taiwan in terms of how civil society is organized. In what way do civil society organizations address contemporary challenges through these initiatives? So it turns out that this sort of distributed network form of social organization as seen in many of the open green projects precisely mirror the patterns of emerging social movements in Taiwan. In 2014, the same year when the Open Green program was launched, Taiwan experienced one of the most profound social and political transformations in recent memory. And with the advent of the Sunflower movements, which involved the occupation of the chamber of the National Legislature for 23 consecutive days by young activists in protest of a trade agreement with China that would allow Chinese capital to control different sectors of the economy and thereby undermining Taiwan's democracy. During the occupation, self-organized citizens and civil society groups also occupied the streets around the National Legislature to prevent the police from entering the legislature and arresting the protesters. The movement culminated in one of the largest demonstrations in Taiwan in recent history. 500,000 people gathered in front of the presidential office in Taipei. And what came out of this was that the confirmation of the agreement, the trade agreement with China, was eventually put on hold in the legislature. Following the movement, the energy catalyzed by the movement was channelized into the emergence of many new kind of political parties, new civil society organizations, and new even social innovation startups. One of which was called Do You a Flavor, so DYAF, a group focusing on initiative to assist the urban poor. One of their first project was called Stone Soup, inspired by the same story I think most of us are familiar with. The idea was to solicit donated food materials and recruit volunteers, cook together and share meals with people experiencing homelessness on the streets. Hundreds, if not thousands of people have since joined this program since 2014. So typically, on the last weekend of each month, there's a sort of Stone Soup event. And the volunteers do not just hand out food, but also sit down and share a meal or just talk to the folks on the streets whose primary struggle was not just the lack of income, but also the experience of social isolation and stigma that come with being on the streets. With the success of the Stone Soup initiative, which is still active today, many years later, DYAF received a grant from Oxfam, which is now has its branch based in Taipei, moved from Hong Kong, to work with street vendors in Taipei. The ones that you might find selling pens, bubble gums on the street corners in Taipei for a small change instead of asking for money. And so unlike the typical kind of community workshop that we're more used to as community designers, DYAF ran a hackathon to have volunteers that they recruit online develop different proposals for this initiative. One project involved developing kind of more attractive products that also link together the different kind of societal actors, so organic producers, farmers, vendors, and consumers. So through products such as this kind of organic dry fruits, banana, and black tea. In the package, you can see that it indicates that different percentage of profit that are allocated to the different participants in this kind of circular economy. So producers, vendors, and the cost for DYAF at different percentage, kind of respectively. In 2015, I joined the beginning of an initiative that I think represented a confluence of the Open Green Initiative and the post-Sunflower movement, social startups, in the basement of this apartment complex called the South Airport Apartment 2. So the second phase of this much larger project. It's a resettlement project built with American aid back in the 1960s. That's how the building looked like back at the time. It was actually, when it was first built, it was actually one of the most advanced modern buildings in the city. But obviously has since fallen into disrepair. The basement space was initially used as a neighborhood market, but has since been vacant for many years. This is what it looked like before the original project got started. In 2015, Zihuai, who's this young guy on the left, who's a young architecture school graduate, applied for an open green grant to renovate a portion of the basement space in hope of activating that space. At the time, I was spending my sabbatical in Taipei researching the social startups. And we actually became the first users of the space when we organized a workshop there. So for the workshop, we actually basically kind of brought together a group of emerging social kind of innovators in Taipei to come join the workshop, network with one another, learn from what each other was doing at the time, including member of DYIF. There was also a hidden agenda which was to bring people to the space so that they could begin to imagine what the space could become, and hopefully might be interested in joining the initiative. So to my very pleasant surprise, a few months later, a group of organizations did move in and form a collective. And this is what it looked like at the time. And they included DYAF, which operated a community kitchen run by volunteers to offer free meals to those in need in the area. This is like one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Taipei, with a large concentration of kind of elderly people experiencing precarity. Another organization, Dream City Building, set up a workshop that offered training to people experiencing homelessness. Kige is a building home, that's kind of the translation, was a program that employed a group of homeless individuals who were former construction workers so that they could have jobs using their skills, and so they used a portion of the space for storage, and also was kind of one of the partner organizations as part of the collective. Green Map, which started the Gufeng White Hut, also joined from the very beginning. And together, so they formed this entity called the Underground Collective, because this occupied this kind of underground space. They also ran a small bookshop and coordinated the operation of that space. So this collective space, now called Nanji Rice, or Nanji Banfan, quickly became a very popular spot for all kinds of community events and activities, including a meeting space for NGOs and social workers in the area, a community market through basically a collaboration of social service organizations in the district. And the market has since been operating for about 4 times a year in different locations throughout the neighborhood. A monthly repair clinic initiated and run by a group of young professionals, engineers. People who needed repair can come at any time during the hours of the monthly free clinic, where they can kind of sign up before. The same space was also used for exercise lessons for residents in the building, and again run also by a volunteer, a retired health professional. So sort of like Mr. Wen in the earlier case. And as a recycling depot, organized in partnership with a clothing company that upcycles plastic bottles for their line of clothing. And because of this pretty unique kind of partnership, they were able to pay a higher price for the recyclers, who are mostly older adults in the neighborhood. So these are just a few initiatives that had happened in the same space. Additionally, on an everyday basis, Nanji Rice also provided a space for staff, neighbors, and volunteers to really kind of bond over meals, conversations, stories, various informal exchanges, and social activities. So building a community and a sort of collective sense of ownership. It is important to know, however, that the group has also experienced challenges and because the space was wide open and anyone could come in and out. Management became challenging, if not time-consuming. So these are the costs that come with civil urbanism without borders as well. So frequent turnover, for example, among staff and volunteers also presented a challenge, especially the young people who tend to stay for a short time and move on because of the point in their career. So after 5 years in operation, Nangji Rise unfortunately came to the end in December 2020. But the end of Nangji Rise actually turned out to be the beginning of something much larger. Even though Nangji Rise ceased operation, Green Map rented a new and even larger space in the same building in a different corner of the basement courtyard. IMA became the name of the new place. At 1,300 square meters, IMA functioned as an even larger multifunctional hub with more flexible spaces for events involving a greater number of partners. This included a second-hand thrift shop for the neighborhood, itself a collaboration between multiple social service organizations, as well as a full-service community makerspace where neighbors and volunteers could come and access the tools that they need or to get help. The combination of a second-hand thrift shop and the makerspace created opportunity to offer classes on repair, reuse, and recycling. So there's kind of synergy that begin to emerge from these different initiatives as well. The classes are open to anyone, and if you volunteer there, you get coupons that you can use at the second-hand shop. IMA recently joined other repair groups around the world and in Taipei to host a local event and for the International Repair Day. So again, civil urbanism without border. In this case, like just kind of national borders. There are also co-working spaces with shared conference rooms. This is the so like Nangji Rise getting like a full upgrade through IMA. Regular second-hand market, again to promote a culture of repair, reuse, and recycling. And similar to Nangji Rise, new events and activities are constantly being added as people come up with new ideas. And these activities and events in turn bring even more people and resources to the place. So again, civil urbanism without border, both kind of spatially and temporally, and also kind of as a form of kind of open source urbanism. In May 2021, after a year of practically zero COVID cases in Taiwan, the Wanhua district where IMA was located became the epicenter of the worst COVID-19 outbreak in the country, as you can see on the map. Initially closed down, like everything else, IMA soon took on a new role as a temporary logistics center for the community where donations would arrive, get sorted, and distributed to those in need with help of staff and volunteers. And the operation was again accomplished through a collaboration of different groups that have been partners with IMA and been working together all these years. And so with IMA kind of providing the space and logistical support, and other groups in charge of either fundraising, soliciting donation, or distributing food and materials to those in need. With additional fundraising, IMA was able to further actually employ people who lost their jobs during COVID and put them to work. So it became sort of like a refuge for folks in many senses whose lives were impacted by the pandemic. So again, civil urbanism at work kind of responding to the needs and crises in the community and filling a gap between institutional responses and the immediate community needs. Examples like Nangji Rise and IMA are just a few cases that exist in Taiwan today. There are also cases like this project called Wawa Vacant Lot Playground, located in an urban indigenous community on the outskirts of Taipei. The project used play and play space as a way of kind of bringing people together. So kids, parents, school teachers, social service organizations, and volunteers. So, a similar kind of model that you see in other projects. And it was featured in my other recent book, Community Rewilding, 也立在身, published in Taiwan just last December. The Open Green program itself, it's now Open Green 2.0, with additional kind of program layers introduced, including a co-learning process involving multiple participating Open Green projects. So, basically, instead of working on this kind of individual project, now the different teams come together to learn from each other. And the collective learning process occurs through activities such as this, field trips, site visits to each other's project that you see in the picture. In 2018, building on the model of collaboration developed through Open Green, we curated a new program called Ways to Community, inviting community design professionals from overseas to work with their local counterparts, including folks from Indonesia, Japan, New Zealand, Thailand, the Netherlands, and the United States. From the United States, I invited Alice Gilliam from the Philadelphia-based public workshop, who led a week-long program with middle school students in Taipei. So using building construction as a way of engaging a variety of different community stakeholders. So this is a diagram basically showing the different stakeholders who have participated in this program, including the local district government, the middle school, a local temple, the Taipei Medical University, which is in the area. And so again, these kind of stakeholders and actors who previously did not have the opportunity of working together are now connected through this program. So work like this has been the focus of another organization that I've been involved, the Pacific Rim Community Design Network, which I co-founded in 1998. We're actually celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, along with a group of scholars and practitioners. The network had a very humble beginning with a group of about 20 people from Japan, Taiwan, and the United States. It has since grown to include colleagues and friends from Hong Kong, China, as well as South Korea, Singapore, other countries in Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, not to mention Canada and Latin America. In fact, many of the publications that we have produced over the years were direct results of collaboration among members of the network, including the book Emerging Civic Urbanism in Asia. So coming full circle back to where we begin in the lecture today. All right, so it's about time to conclude. So in my talk today, I have mobilized the concept of civic urbanism without border in three ways. First, to offer a different perspective towards the practices of community-based design that has historically focused on well-defined place-based communities. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think what we have seen today kind of show other possibilities as well. So civic urbanism without borders suggests a more nimble, fluid, open-ended and open source form of community design. As well as placemaking that address the limitations of community-based design as commonly practiced today. Compared with traditional forms of place-based community planning and design, civic urbanism without border facilitates a greater mobilization of individuals and organizations, as well as the relationship and resources that come with them. The spaces that it creates function as a sort of what we call a contact zone, a term borrowed from Mary Louise Platt, basically in reference to the spaces that allow individuals and kind of organizations occupying different ends of the social spectrum to meet, connect, and interface with one another. So create an opportunity for learning, negotiating, and relationship building that contribute to a more robust form of civil urbanism, or urbanism by the people. Second, civil urbanism without borders suggests an important shift in civil society organizing in Taiwan and elsewhere today. In contrast to the more kind of old school form of social movements, the recent forms of this kind of distributed self-organized initiative enable the mobilization and participation of a broader range of individuals and social groups in addressing pressing social issues in society today. And this greater degree of mobilization and participation is critical to the practice of democracy beyond the formal institutions and electoral politics. Third and finally, civil urbanism without border can serve as an important lens to examine the practices of democracy and community-based design today, including the continued barriers and challenges. In Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, and in other places, democracy remains fragile, problematic, and contested, if not becoming increasingly circumscribed. In Hong Kong, for example. For instance, through the case studies in the book, we found that state continue to play a very dominant role, continue a long history and tradition in East Asia in particular, and that civil urbanism is often than not co-opted by neoliberal policy and politics, and that citizen and community engagement remain low level relative to other political processes at work. Nevertheless, civil urbanism remains fundamental to the future of democracy and democratic practices in the region. Civil urbanism without border, in form of Open Green Initiative and networks like the Pacific Rim Community Design Network, for instance, can serve as a vehicle for collaboration and collective learning that I believe contribute to the continued evolution and advancement of democratic city making. These networks are something that I think we can contribute to as citizens, educators, and design professionals. And lastly, I want to just acknowledge Fulbright Taiwan and Global Taiwan Institute based in Washington, D.C., and the International Institute for Asian Studies for supporting this work, and I look forward to your feedback and questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Jeff.
Okay.
Is the sound okay? Okay. So one of the things that in our Global Taiwan Study Program is really not just focus on Taiwan. It's really, we sort of say it again and again, is really want to use Taiwan as a site to think about international issue, global affairs, and so I would appreciate the talk that you give, that sort of using this one site to open up questions about civic activisms, about open space design, and of course democracy and political movement, both in Taiwan, but of course East Asia, but also potentially elsewhere in the world. And so really appreciate that the way this to address that, and of course that very few scholars, at least in my own discipline, is able to address such a wide range of sites, right? So I think that's a really important interventions. Given that, I'm sure that your talk is also engage many of the issues that is relevant to students and faculties and the communities here associated with the Daniel faculty. And so even though I have many questions and I want to ask, but I think that I would want to open up for now, that also sort of allow people to have a Q&A with Professor Jeff Hoff, because it's a wonderful opportunity to have conversation. Mm-hmm. So I would just quickly and moderate, so if you feel free to make comments and ask questions. I saw hands. Yeah, please. That light is bright.
Hi, Professor Hall. Thank you for such an inspirational lecture. This is more of observational comment than question. So one of the things that intrigued me throughout your presentation is this terms of remaking city or community redeveloping, this notion of redoing something. In terms of the design, in the context of a design school, I'm really curious the role of designer in those specific case studies in Taiwan. For me, just hearing your case studies, I find something really inspirational is that the designer's role or the design practice in those cases seems to provide opportunities, design in the way that allows flexibility for the community participant to engage in an undesigning process. So in a way, it's remaking cities like giving the right or the tools to the people, the community members to undesign in a way that's suitable for the specific conditions that the project was able to evolve through different phases, different time. And I thought that was really inspirational, and I wish you could elaborate on this notion of redoing something. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think not only kind of redoing something, but even the notion of design, I think, become problematic in many of the examples that I have shown today. And it's something I think a lot of professionals struggle as well when you like work face to face with the community. I think one of the main kind of realization, at least for me, I think this applies for many others, is like, through these projects we realize that design is much more than just form making. There's a distinction between like design as a sort of enterprise, as a practice, and form making is kind of one component of that. So what I really want to say is that it is still a work in progress. It's still a struggle among many of those who have been involved with the Open Green project, as well as kind of many other initiatives that I've shown today. And the idea of redoing something or remaking something, I think, is part of that realization as well. Like, how can we leverage what is already there, right? So if you look at design as a kind of as a participatory enterprise, right? How can we leverage the skill that people have in the community, right? So for example, like Mr. Wen, like a retired engineer, how can we leverage his knowledge and experience and skill and make that part of this project? So instead of like inventing something new, right? How can we build something that is already there? Not just the actual physical space. It's the vacant building, the two-story vacant building was there already, right? So like transforming that, reusing the recycling, the space, but not just the space, physical space itself, but also like social, the capital, assets in the community, the knowledge, experiences, relationships, connections. Those are all kind of at play. If we realize that, if we think about designing in a much kind of broader sense, beyond just form making. So that's kind of a short response to your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ho, for the amazing lecture. My question has to do with how you frame the idea of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's especially timely you put the Sunflower Revolution slide up. And I was wondering, for example, Manuel Castells are the people who try to talk about the link between urban protests or
Mm-hmm.
urban revolution in relation to maybe more social or the orthodox kind of Marxist revolutions. I was wondering how you could frame, how you would think of your work in this like these village kind of collectives in mobilizing this scalability. And as well, you mentioned in, like you really nicely put in the 2014 kind of time space, there is the sunflower movement, but at the same time you were doing these collectives in this kind of overlapped time space. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that kind of overlaps and how it's being scaled or not.
Okay, well, there's a lot in that question. So I think first, resistance in a lot of my work is defined very broadly. It's not just protest or revolution or revolt. There's kind of more explicit form of resistance. For me, resistance also include everyday practices. How we we're resisting something, not directly fighting against it, but find ways of trying to undercut, circumvent so resistant in sort of more kind of everyday sense. So the work of James C. Scott, for example, Weapons of the Weak. So he covers a lot of that from his study in Southeast Asia, and we can see that in many other contexts as well. And so a lot of the examples that I show, they don't come across as resistance, but in some way they are resisting against perhaps the sort of the normative kind of structures in society, this expectation that we're all supposed to get, that young people are all supposed to get jobs and follow the career track and things like that, especially in East Asia. And so resistance, I think, comes in many forms, and so that's kind of what, in terms of kind of definition. You mentioned about scalability. I think that is also that comes into play really as a sort of a connector between this kind of everyday resistance and the more kind of organized form of resistance, right? And my argument in looking at these cases, that we need for people to become conscious of issues in society. We need to kind of provide opportunity. We need to kind of lower the thresholds that allow kind of community organizing to happen, right? It's more difficult to get people to protest on the streets, except in very extraordinary times, the recent movement in Hong Kong, for example. On an everyday basis, I think we need to create more opportunity for engagement, and that's where these kind of everyday form of resistance come in. That is probably more accessible, is probably more something that people feel more comfortable participating in. And so the opportunity like that, I think, allow that organization to happen. And then, for example, the case of IMA during COVID, right? How that kind of everyday resistance can scale up in the event of extraordinary crisis, right? But that organization, that collaboration would not have happened if not for the everyday practice that occurred beforehand, right? So that's how that kind of scalability really kind of come into play. So, and then there was something else in your question that I'm probably forgetting. Okay, right. Thank you.
Any?
Hello, Professor Ho. I find the case you share is very inspiring, especially the Nanji program.
Yeah.
You mentioned that after the 5 years, the program kind of evolved into the IMA program.
Right.
So there is a continuity of that project. But at the same time, a lot of cases you share, like for example, some community gardens, like solar projects, they didn't continue. And you mentioned one cost of civic urbanism is maintenance issues. And I'm wondering, is there any reasons disrupting the continuity of civic urbanism? And what kind of lessons you learned from it? And thank you so much.
Right. Thank you for the question. I think one lesson from the example that I've shown today is that maybe it's not so critical if a project sort of ends or stops, as long as the idea or the social relationship or some sort of network, some sort of asset, were able to find another way, to continue, right? And this comes back to the notion of resilience, which I did not touch upon today. I recently wrote a paper on this idea of civic resilience, and largely kind of responds to a lot of things that we have seen, during COVID, during the pandemic, like mutual aid efforts, self-help, and things like that. So again, this perhaps come back to the other question earlier about design. Right? Design is more than just form making. So perhaps like the importance and essence of these projects is more than just the longevity of the initiative. Right? It's probably important to recognize that we, as individuals, as social group, have limitations. Right? So, for example, one of the key leaders of Nanji Rice, he's like 20-something. I got to know him quite well. So Eric Lee, and he was really struggling at the time because he just came out of school. He was interested in cooperative economy, and he just came upon this opportunity. And it was not making much money, anyway, so it's a struggle. At one point, it's probably not very healthy if he just kept doing. It's healthier for him to just drop the project and allow other people to take leadership and allow this project to continue in some other form. So there's I guess what I'm saying is that there's it's important to recognize not only the kind of the opportunities and possibility and being inspired by these cases, but also to kind of recognize that that we as individuals all have kind of our own kind of limitations, and this is where civic urbanism become really critical. So our ability to collaborate with other people, that we don't have to do everything ourselves. It's better that we work with other people. So that network of organizations, individuals, the relationship, the social capital that came out of the process, I think it's much more important and critical than just the individual initiatives themselves. So I hope that answers your question.
Maybe I can ask a question also, because I found it sort of fascinating, but perhaps to sort of pick up some of the comments here about resistance, right? So, because you work across, at least East Asia, different cities, and obviously there are a lot of similarities among themselves, but there are also differences, right, in terms of political system and the kind of developments. And for instance, you kind of think about places like China, but also increasingly Hong Kong, right? When we think about those, we think about the authoritarian system itself. So when you talk about civic urbanism, people kind of think about the tension between the so-called state and society. Yeah. So when we talk about bottom-up urbanism, so it's sort of the implication here, there's a top-down, right, with the cohesive forces, right? So that tend to focus on certain types of civic urbanism. But my first question here is when we think about places like Taiwan, Taipei, for instance, think about Seoul or even Japan. And so in these cases, sometimes the tension is not so much about civil, the state and society, right? But within the civil society, what kind of politics that might emerge in the civic space? Because you show images where the occupation of the legislature, the Sunflower movement in Taiwan, I think that's 2016, right? And that they certainly point to one particular direction of political movement. But I was wondering, in some of the other spaces that you talk about, right? How does the kind of internal political differences play out in those space, In other words, not unlike our own work here, that a lot of these spaces also increasingly become polarized.
Right.
And the states, and regardless whether the so-called progressive party come into power or a conservative party come into power, they are still neoliberal, right? So the question here is, what kind of civic space, what kind of politics of civic space within those society where the tension between state and society are not so obvious?
Right. Yeah. Very good question. There are a few cases I did not include today because it's limited time, and some of them have to do with these are kind of emerging kind of social innovation projects. So similar to the one I've shown, but focusing on engaging migrant workers. Okay, so a very different kind of demographic group. Right? So most of the cases I've shown today are more the typical kind of Taiwanese communities, but we have a pretty significant population of people from overseas who work in Taiwan, either in the factories or as domestic workers at home. There's still a lot of societal kind of bias against people from overseas. And then oftentimes there are news about people engaged in criminal activities that further kind of entrench this kind of stigma that the migrant workers kind of have in the Taiwanese society. So a lot of the initiatives are trying to overcome those biases, right? So this is not really about state civil society tension, but more about kind of tension within the society among the different demographic groups. Right? So for one project, for example, is called 140, and so it's acknowledgement of the 1/40th of the population in Taiwan are actually people from overseas, right? Either as new immigrants or as migrant workers. Right? So their program, they have for example language program for the migrant workers, right? So that they can pick up more kind of Mandarin Chinese, so they can perform better at jobs. They also have what they call a migrant business school, and so that the migrant worker can come on the weekends, pick up business skill, and so that when they go back to their home country, they are better able to start their own business and become more successful economically. And this project has been going on since 2014. So about the same time as all the other things that are going on. And they have already really become really successful. So they started with 2 paid staff. Now they have a staff of about 15, 20 people, and with constant source of kind of revenue. Donations and sponsorship by kind of corporations as well. And so that's just kind of one example. There are also other examples that other projects that focusing on really kind of better serving the migrant workers community, donating books, engage them in all sorts of cultural activities, and activity that brings not only serve the migrant workers as a kind of a target group, also we bring together people from different backgrounds, right? So they can learn from each other. There are people who interested in learning Burmese, who are interested in learning other culture from Southeast Asia, and then we have these folks right in Taiwan. So the perfect opportunity to create this kind of connection that would not have existed before. So that's kind of one example.
Right. But a quick follow-up on that, just compare the case with Taiwan, for instance, for instance, in some of these examples that you give about hackathons and all these different practices, aside from the migrant worker, for instance, that within Taiwanese society where you have the two main political camps, for instance, do they come together in those spaces, or they are often used by one particular group of people who have particular political orientations?
Yeah, I'm sure the politics is everywhere.
Right.
We're talking about Taiwan, and but this, the Open Green program has survived through different administrations in Taipei under different political party, right? So it started actually under KMT, which is the Conservative Party, right? And it's then the previous administration, who's the Cohen's was the independent candidate. It's still around. It's gone back to KMT, but it's still around. And then the money that the Taipei government has to support the Open Green program is actually coming from the central government, which is under DBP, which the Green Camp. So this particular program is not really kind of affiliated with any political party. Although a lot of the like the younger social startup, they do align more with the more progressive side of the politics. And but a lot of them are they don't have a kind of a very explicit kind of political agenda. Other than I think everybody are in support of kind of democracy, but even KMT is not against that.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other comments, questions? Well, I certainly have more, but if you still have maybe a few minutes.
If we have time, yes.
Yeah. So the flip side of that question is, in places that are, where the states become, not just powerful, but also increasingly kind of repressive, right? So, so a lot of your work is about sort of thinking about civic urbanisms as a way of promoting social justice and equity. So, as I said in the introduction, a lot of the geopolitical landscape and the political economy, particularly in Asia, but also elsewhere, has transformed rather rapidly, in the past 10 years, and especially in the past few years. One of the things that come with the transformation is actually the technologies, the everyday technologies, right? Particularly thinking about surveillance, and I'm sure a lot of us here knows about the story of Google Sidewalk Labs, even though it was eventually canceled, right? But that was sort of the example, in Toronto, the example where, technologies become so important in terms of intruding into the everyday life, right? So, but then in coming back to the example that you're giving, places like, for instance, Hong Kong or even China, the kind of civic urbanism, I'm asking something else speculative, right? Because it's probably beyond your research also. We have a big pack of difficulty doing research in those spaces is precisely the existing state infrastructure, create all the obstacles. So the question is, yes, if the concern is really about social justice and equities, bottom up, civic urbanism, then in places where it is in fact increasingly difficult to conduct those activities because of the ever powerful sovereign states, what would be the future, if we can speculate, what would the future of civic urbanism, how do we talk about civic urbanism in that context where for those people who know something about, say, if you travel doing research in China, that you kind of, anywhere you go, it's now, right, subway, and then there was tons of cameras scanning you constantly, and wherever you go. So so that's sort of kind of new kind of context for everyday life, right? So in that near future or even now, what kind of civic urbanism can we still imagine?
Right. Well, obviously, things are becoming. I think in China, particularly, I think the system has become so much more repressive in the last few years, to a point that is like one can, question if anything can, still happen there, right? But the interesting thing is that during COVID, we have seen even more civic urbanism or civic activism, than before, right? So people, self-organize to, purchase, groceries, right? These kind of form of kind of self-help. They are also, in Wuhan actually is known as the punk capital of China. So there's a lot of live houses, live music. And I heard this from my friends there, like the lighthouse, because they have this network of they're basically their customers. So people come and listen to live music, and so they sort of leverage their social media network to organize rides for people to go from place to place during the lockdown, right? Because the public transportation was not functioning, and so people organize way to have these kind of it's basically a self-organized transportation system through the Lighthouse. So the things that we would not have imagined before, actually exploded during the pandemic, right? And not just in China, in Singapore. I mean, it's another sort of totalitarian state, even though it's a very liberal, economy. We have seen so many more self-help, mutual aid, civil urbanism, and people actually are kinder to migrant workers during donations. The National University of Singapore students organize online lessons for migrant workers who live, temporarily kind of live in their dormitories, so that they can experience, they can have a student experience as part of living on campus. So these are the things that we have not imagined before, can still happen in a pretty oppressive system. And so I'm still hopeful. I think this goes back to the earlier question about this kind of everyday resistance. I think people can be very creative in circumventing, the state control. To an extent, I think, it's really kind of another level. And I think I'm still kind of optimistic in terms of what could happen, that are able to kind of sustain, some, level of resistance. And when the moment is right, things can still explode. Those two things can still happen.
Well, thank you. Yeah. That's it's always good to be hopeful, right? And I think that might be a nice way of wrapping this up. But so thanks again for coming all the way to give this fantastic lecture. And I will return this to Professor Nguyen for closing. Yes.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you very much, Jeffrey and Tong, for that wonderful talk and for the conversation. Before we disperse, I'd just like to quickly bring to your attention two of our upcoming public programming events, one later this week and one in a few weeks. This Thursday, on March 16th, we're very excited to be launching the exhibition Resolutions for the Antarctic, International Stations in the Antarctic Data Space. It is curated by Unless, a design collective. It's a non-profit agency devoted to interdisciplinary research on extreme environments threatened by the planetary crisis. The exhibition integrates the collective efforts of more than 200 international experts from the fields of science, geopolitics, and architecture to address the Antarctic's unique challenges and opportunities. We will be premiering a short film on the subject, as well as hosting an open access site developed by Unless to enable the global dissemination, downloading, and translation of research conducted thus far. Unless's founder, architect Julia Foscari, will be conducting a talk at the opening with Dean Xuandu, our dean here, of course, and this will take place downstairs in our Architecture and Design Gallery at 6:30 p.m. again on Thursday, just in 2 short days. And then on March 30th, Lyndon Neri of the acclaimed Shanghai-based studio Neri and Hugh will be joining us for the last event in our Winter 2023 public programming series. His talk is entitled Ruinophilia and will cover the history and function of ruins. Tickets, I'm told, is moving fast, so please reserve your spot on our website if you hope to attend, and the lecture will take place right here in this very same room at 6:30 again on the 30th at the end of this month. So on that note, we hope to see you there, and thank you again for this talk and conversation today. Thank you.